Well, hello everyone. My name is John Lustria. I'm the education coordinator with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Amelia Wald. She's the executive director of the Virginia Club of New York, and she'll explain that in just a moment. Thanks so much for being with us today, Amelia.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's nice to have some face-to-face interaction, even if it's virtual.
That's right. It always helps. And more specifically for our purposes, Amelia is an esteemed author of one of our blog posts all about the transformation of the University of Virginia from a university to a hospital during the Civil War. And we'll get to that in just a moment. I want to start things off by saying thank you so much for watching. Glad to have you with us today. And if you can, if you enjoy this and other videos that we've been doing, please go ahead and like them, share them, tell your friends about them, and all that sort of thing. Like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, all that good stuff, in order for you to see the latest stuff that we come out with all the time. And with our museum doors being closed, if you've enjoyed the videos, please consider maybe becoming a member of the museum and help participate in this new digital push that we've been undertaking. And if you can't become a member at this time, even a small donation goes a long way. Just helps us keep doing what we're doing. So if you're at a place where you can do that, that'd be great. If you can't do that at this time, even just sharing the videos help us quite a bit. So thanks so much for watching. We hope you've been enjoying them. I know I have enjoyed connecting with some of you as a result of all these videos. It's been fun to make a new set of virtual friends. So anyway, thanks for being with us. And speaking of moving things digitally, I wanted to ask Amelia about her experience with that and in what she does. So maybe talk a little bit about what that's been like for you. You all watching these videos presumably kind of have an idea of, we've upped our video content and our digital content, so you kind of have an idea what the museum's been doing. But here to offer another perspective is Amelia.
Yeah, I would love to share some of the virtual events we've been doing. So for those of you who don't have context on the Virginia Club of New York, which I would assume would be most people, we are essentially the UVA alumni chapter in New York City, and we are in residence in the Yale Club of New York City, which is a college clubhouse. So normally we would be hosting in-person lectures and wine tasting and all sorts of really, really fun events, both inside of the Yale Club and then throughout the New York City area. And of course, being in New York City, we were shut down pretty quickly in mid-March. And so we realized as we were in this for the long haul that we wanted to continue engaging with our alumni and parents and friends in the area. And so we pivoted to a virtual events platform now. And we've seen amazing opportunities and really exciting events to grow out of it. In some cases, it's just taking what would have been a typical program for us and moving it digitally. So for instance, we every single year have hosted an arts panel for I think probably 15 years now, or we do a finance panel. This is our 20th annual this year. Both of those we were able to get the same moderators that we would have had. We were still able to get phenomenal panelists, and it's just going to be over Zoom as opposed to being in person. But then we've also seen some really innovative brand new events. So one of ours that, for those of you who don't know, a UVA alumni is called a Who, H-O-O. So we kind of play off of that pun pretty often. And we've created an event series that we call Who's in the Know. And it's taking alumni who are sometimes based out of New York City, but fortunately, because everything is virtual now, we can actually turn to alumni all over the country. And we're talking about niche topics. In one case, we talked about the food and beverage industry. In another, we're talking about indoor wellness and healthy buildings. And whereas in person, these events would have been restricted to the New York area, now we're able to reach people all across the country. So for me, at least, that's been very exciting to see us coming up with innovative programming that isn't just well suited to New Yorkers, but is well suited to anyone across the country. So, and really across the world. I mean, we've had people call in from London or from Australia sometimes. So it's been really lovely to see how easy it is to connect with people across geographic regions.
Agreed. That's been a pleasure on our end as well. I mean, we host events obviously quite often at the museum in Frederick, Maryland, which has a little bit of a limit in terms of who all can come. But in some of these live streams and videos that we've done, and we've had people tuning in from all over the world and the country. people from Colorado. I see you, Ryan, out there. And people from Ireland and Norway and even Russia. I mean, it's really been pretty delightful just to kind of see this kind of community that's interested in Civil War medical history kind of come up, and I'll get to kind of participate in these videos in some way. And we've been overwhelmed by their generosity as well. We've gotten quite a few new members out of this, and it's been fun kind of building that community and kind of getting to experiment on the fly, kind of out of necessity. But it's like we were saying before this, I mean, this whole COVID-19 business, I think, is a net negative, but there have absolutely been some positive aspects to come out of it.
Yeah, it's lovely to see all sorts of people, getting access to new material that they weren't even aware of before. I know that, at least for me, being taken into a virtual landscape has increased my curiosity about reconnecting with old friends or old acquaintances. And I'm writing letters again, which has always been one of my favorite pastimes. It was kind of reserved for thank you letters to family after Christmases or birthdays. So now I have all sorts of pen pals that used to be my neighbors that have since relocated across the country. So it's been really lovely finding new ways to connect.
Absolutely. So now we're going to go ahead and shift, start talking about your blog post here. So tell us a little bit about the inspiration for the post. I mean, I think it had perhaps another life as a paper when you were at University of Virginia, but talk a little bit about how you got on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a recent grad of UVA. I graduated in 2019, so just a year ago. And when I was at UVA, I had a really, really wonderful research internship with the now Center for Civil War History that was at UVA. It's NAU, not NOW, which I know is a common misunderstanding. And through that internship, I was able to research all sorts of really, really fascinating stories about Charlottesville during the Civil War and UVA during the Civil War. And I specifically worked on two projects. One was called UVA Unionists, which is about UVA alumni who actually fought for the Union Army rather than the Confederate Army. And then another one that's called Black Virginians in Blue, which is about Black men who were born in Albemarle County who later went on to serve in USCT units. So two really, really phenomenal projects. And part of that project, the creators of the project wanted to build in background information and background essays. And so one of my last projects I did with them was about UVA and Charlottesville during the Civil War. And one of the big topics in that kind of background article was the Charlottesville Hospital, the General Hospital, which was fascinating. And of course, it was a small piece of a larger story. And so the blog post was really fun because I got to dive a lot deeper into this really compelling story and get more into the nitty gritty a little bit. So that was really fun. And it was actually a piece that I wrote after I had relocated to New York and had started working full time. So it was fascinating. It wasn't quite the research style I was used to because I didn't have access to any of these physical books anymore, and I couldn't go into the special collections library at UVA. But something that's really, really wonderful about the UVA librarians is they have digitized so much of the resources there. And so being able to work on this project by either looking back at old notes or being able to log into the digital resources through special collections was a really fun way for me, at least as someone who no longer works in historical studies, to be able to go back to that passion and get back in the swing of things.
Yeah, shout out to librarians and archivists everywhere for all the wonderful work that they do to make things like this possible. So thank you for all that. Well, that's I enjoy that your response about how it was fun to kind of get back into that. We actually get that a lot from some of our guest blog authors who, the length of a blog, it's kind of just long enough that you can really dive in on a kind of a small scenario. And a lot of people have expressed, how much they enjoyed getting to dive a little bit deeper into this one thing that, isn't quite, the length of a book or even a chapter, but just this little kind of story that they can blow out to just long enough to give it real justice. So I'm glad that you enjoyed that as well.
Absolutely.
So to start things off here, why specifically the University of Virginia? Why was that chosen to be a hospital? What was it about it?
Sure. I would say that there are kind of two main reasons. Number one is location. It was located between several different rail lines, including the Orange and Alexandria, so it was much easier to transport patients and casualties and whatnot into the Charlottesville area. And also Charlottesville is quite close to Richmond. I mean, nowadays, maybe an hour drive, depending on the traffic. And so having close rail lines and being close to the Confederate capital made Charlottesville a pretty convenient location. And then, of course, the University of Virginia's medical school being there meant that they had doctors and medical students and, potential faculty members and surgeons for the hospital. And so that was really the two main reasons, was location and then the proximity of the medical school.
So would some of the medical students at the time work in the hospital?
Yeah, they did. So some of the current students chose to volunteer at the hospital. Of course, enrollment at the university drastically decreased at the start of the Civil War. So UVA was one of the few schools to stay open throughout the course of the Civil War, but even though it was ostensibly open, classes in the student body were very, very reduced. I mean, there were never more than about 60 students at the university at a time, and enrollment had been in the hundreds beforehand. And so a lot of the faculty members pivoted their typical course schedule into working at that Confederate Charlottesville General Hospital. And something that was different, I think, for the medical students at the time was that most of the University of Virginia's School of Medicine curriculum was primarily theoretical. They didn't have a hospital, actually, until this military hospital moved in. And so the closest they would get to really interacting with patients and anatomy and on a hands-on basis was the anatomical theater. But the military hospital really gave them a lot more hands-on experience than they would have been having previously.
That's a great point. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that prior to the Civil War, that hands-on experience was really hard to come by. Not just in Charlottesville, but in a variety of places, even in kind of large urban centers like Philadelphia, where there are a lot of hospitals. This dissecting of cadavers and operating on patients, it was less common than you would think. And so the Civil War represents this turning point in the medical education. There's suddenly an abundance of bodies that need help, dead bodies that can be dissected. It's this whole new world. It doesn't get focused on very often, but it's well worth noting, just like you did there. So talk about some of the doctors who worked in the hospital there, especially Dr. Ariana Moon.
I think Oriana, I don't know for certain. Apparently her nickname was Ori, O-R-I-E, which is how she signed letters to family members and whatnot. She was a female doctor at the hospital, actually, which is pretty uncommon. I think at the time there were less than 40 practicing female physicians in the United States. And so she was born in Albemarle County, which is where Charlottesville is located. And her father was a wealthy landowner and had sent her off to private school and boarding school and had tutors around her. And she had chosen to study medicine, actually. And so she went to Philadelphia and studied at a women's medical college. In Philadelphia, I believe there were 6 women in her graduating class, so very, very small graduating class. And she then returns to Charlottesville after her stint in education and in medical education. And I don't believe she immediately started practicing, but when the hospital opened up, of course, a lot of women in Charlottesville were very, very pro-Confederate, and there were all sorts of ladies' relief associations that were pro-Confederate organizations. And actually, John Stagg Davis, who is the lead faculty member at the hospital, his wife ran the Charlottesville area ladies' association for Confederate patriotism, essentially. And so they reached out to Dr. Moon and asked if she would consider working at the hospital. And she stepped up as the head of the nurses board, essentially. So she oversaw the nurses. And of course, there was a fair amount of tension between her and some of the male doctors. I mean, based on some of the writings, essentially most of the men thought that she was fairly well skilled and thought that she was a nice addition, but ultimately they thought that when the war ended that women shouldn't be in medical professions. And so she eventually married a fellow doctor. I believe he was with an Alabama regiment, I want to say, and he was working at the hospital. They met, they married, and then after the war ended, she and her husband moved away from Charlottesville, and then she ceased the practice of medicine and became a homemaker, just because there weren't really any opportunities for her to use her medical school skills outside of her immediate family.
Yeah, and the annals of women doctors and nurses during the Civil War are filled with all of these kind of headbutting incidents with some of the male doctors there, and some of them are more intense than others, of course. Some of them are just sort of, I'd rather you not be here, but since you're here, you may as well help. And sometimes they're wholehearted embrace, and other times it's just, degrades the working relationship to the point where it just can't even be a thing. So it's, yeah, she's definitely a part of that kind of checkered history. But you point to something that I think is really important to highlight, is that the opportunity of wartime kind of creates a lot of these opportunities for these women who aspire to be healthcare professionals, and it kind of creates this massive opportunity that wasn't there before, and that is capitalized on by all kinds of people. And in some cases, it leads to lasting, work in the field. Dr. Mary Walker is kind of a famous example in this regard, who goes on to all kinds of accolades after the Civil War in the medical field. But sometimes it doesn't always work out, in the end, for one reason or the other. But yeah, she was a character I very much enjoyed reading about in your post. Um, do we have a sense of what it was like for students who were still attending the university to kind of be on campus while it was a hospital? And it was a hospital for the entire war, correct?
Yeah, so the first patients came in, I believe, after Battle of Manassas, and then the Battle of Port Republic was when the biggest influx of patients came in. At that time, I think 1,400 patients came in from that one battle. So the whole university structure is fundamentally changing, and all of these academic buildings are being taken over as patients in the hospital continue to grow. And so I'm sure day-to-day life was fundamentally different for the few students who chose to stay. And for the most part, their classmates have since left their studies, most of whom have gone off and, contributed to the Confederate war effort in some capacity. And so their class schedule looks different, their class sizes look different. A lot of them are choosing to volunteer at the hospital. Some of them seek permission from the Board of Visitors, which is the governing body of the university, to go and volunteer in the hospital rather than continue some of their studies. And so their whole lives, it seems like, have been upended for sure.
And an example that's at least closer to home for the museum in Frederick after the Battle of Antietam. Frederick, a town of 8,000 people, ends up having to care for 8,000 wounded soldiers, and there's a school there, the Visitation Academy for women aspiring to be nuns or in the Catholic orders. That school still goes on while being used as a hospital, and they write extensively about how their day-to-day routine gets completely upended, which is something that I think we can empathize with at least a little bit nowadays. So there's some definite parallels there. The African American community in Charlottesville, can you talk a little bit about their relationship with the hospital? Of course, slavery still exists in the southern states at this time, but there is also a community of free Black people living in town. I'm curious about how that all worked.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a huge enslaved and free Black population in Charlottesville at the time. And of course, they're operating with very, very limited rights and loads of oppression, as you would imagine. So quite a few Black men, both enslaved and free, are conscripted into Confederate service, which is happening all over the Confederacy. And before those men are then forcibly sent into Confederate service and put off into all sorts of positions and assigned all kinds of duties, they have to have a physical examination, which I would imagine would be incredibly degrading, to have a Confederate doctor examining whether or not you're physically capable of doing these tasks that I would imagine most of those men are not interested in performing. So number one, they're going to interact with the hospital by these physical examinations. A lot of those men are then conscripted into service at the hospital. So the kind of biggest task that was left to African Americans was to become grave diggers. So there's about, I think, 1,100 patients who die at the hospital over the course of 4 years of the war. And so these African American men are then forced to become grave diggers, and the Confederate hospital cemetery is adjacent to the university cemetery, which actually still stands and you can still visit to this day. And I think something that, in terms of the modern day impact of that cemetery, that is fascinating in sort of a disturbing way, is that there, obviously Charlottesville is a hot spot for, lost cause memory and Confederate memorials. And although the Robert E. Lee memory and the memory in the downtown mall are sort of the hot spot and the biggest center, and a young woman named Zion O'Brien is the one who really brought that to the national forefront, that there is actually a Confederate monument in the cemetery that's adjacent to the university cemetery, and it's a Confederate soldier, and I think the caption is something like, "Fate denied them victory, but they have some sort of glorious immortality." And so it's very, very clearly a send up to lost cause memory. And these African-American men were the ones who dug those graves, which is what this monument is now standing on top of. So you, to this day, sort of see the influence of African-Americans' forced involvement in the hospital cemetery. Some of African-Americans in the area, free African-American women, did choose to work at the hospital as nurses. They were receiving a decent wage, actually. And so for a lot of them, it was how they were able to keep their families fed and put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. So some of them chose to work at the hospital in a nursing capacity, but for the most part, African-Americans working in the hospital were conscripted there.
That's a great point, a great interpretive layer when kind of thinking about the cemetery that's there. And that's the case so much on Civil War landscapes, both, cemeteries, hospitals, and battlefields. This kind of unseen, sometimes it's very visible, but this unseen kind of layer of African-American involvement is so pervasive. And what it calls to mind for me is on the Gettysburg battlefield, a lot of the roads and avenues were kind of paved and created in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which in that kind of group of it was primarily African-American men. And so the people that made the roads and avenues, which, most people don't think twice about on a battlefield of, white men, north and south fighting, were paved by African Americans. It's just fascinating, all these layers that are right in front of us, but sometimes you don't even know enough to know to look for them. And so I think that's so fascinating that you bring that up. We probably should have done this a little bit earlier, but give us some statistics for the hospital. I mean, you rattled a few numbers off, but how many patients were treated there? What was the capacity? How often did patients come there? All that sort of stuff.
Sure, absolutely. So from what I remember off the top of my head and a brief scan through my old notes, there were about 22,000 patients that were treated at the hospital over the course of the war. So sizable number. The hospital had, I want to say, 500 beds, give or take, and at any one point there could be 15 to 50 doctors on staff, some of whom were faculty members at the university and some of whom were military doctors who were assigned there for the time being. I think 5,000 of the patients treated at the hospital were for gunshot wounds, so a lot of the patients being treated were not for battlefield casualties, which I'm sure your museum has all sorts of facts and figures and context about. And then I think I mentioned this earlier, but a little over 1,000 patients died and obviously had to be buried in the Charlottesville area. I think those are the big ones that come to mind. But if there are others you're curious about, I would say, probably look at my blog post because that has them written down, and take a look at the footnotes as well, because there really are some fascinating statistics, and so many of local historians and archivists and the UVA Special Collections Library have done a really phenomenal job of tracking down those records and trying to keep track of those records. And the School of Medicine actually has their own, or the health system, I should say, has their own special collections library as well. And so they have some really fascinating information on the medical school, but then in particular, the Charlottesville General Hospital and the kinds of patients they treated.
Very cool. Yeah, the mortality rate there, I think, is really interesting and worth pointing out. Only about 1,000 deaths out of 22,000 patients, which is, I'm not a mathematician. I think that's what, 5-ish% or something like that.
I am neither a mathematician either, so.
Yeah, the perils of getting two history majors to talk about math. But I think it's somewhere around there, which I think is, that mortality rate is a lot lower than maybe some people might guess. for a Civil War hospital, which just speaks to I mean, these doctors are skilled. They don't know about germ theory, unfortunately, but these doctors are very skilled. And I think that kind of highlights that nicely. Um, Talk a little bit about the kind of drama that existed between the governing board of the University of Virginia and the Confederate government who placed the hospital there. And I think it's not unlike the sort of back and forth that would come between the Confederate government impressing enslaved people from their owners. It was this kind of frustration about government control. Maybe break that down a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the beginning, the University of Virginia and the Charlottesville area are seemingly thrilled to be able to support the Confederate war effort, and they seem more than
Be careful what you wish for.
precisely. And so they seem very, very willing to set up this general hospital, and the city of Charlottesville provides some of the funding to get the hospital off the ground. And of course, the university is lending out their faculty in order to assist with the hospital. So it seems like they are all gung-ho in the beginning because they are pro-Confederate, patriots, so to speak. But then as the war drags on, I think they realize how chaotic the reality of hosting a military hospital is. And the hospital initially is only taking up a certain portion of grounds. That grows and grows and grows until so much of the university, I mean, tons of student rooms and academic buildings are being taken over. At one point, I mean, Monticello isn't part of the university, but at one point, Monticello is discussed as a potential site for a smallpox hospital. So the hospital is definitely spreading and having a very significant impact on the city, on the university. It's disrupting university operations. It's causing damage to university buildings, which is, of course, infuriating the Board of Visitors because they already don't have any money. It seems like, so much of their tuition has gone out the window because they're having less students. And so at one point, the Board of Visitors kind of get into this little tiff with the Confederate government, and they propose a compromise, I want to say in 1863, and they basically say, we will waive the damage that your hospital has caused to our property if you are willing to send us prisoners who have been sentenced to hard labor to assist with all of the increased labor that we're now experiencing because of this hospital. And so I actually don't know whether or not the Confederate government consented to that request, but I'm under the impression that they did, because if you look back through the minutes of the Board of Visitors, it seems like that issue has been somewhat resolved. And then, of course, in, I want to say 1865, I should know this off the top of my head, and I don't. But General Custer comes in, and General Sheridan come in, and they actually retake the city of Charlottesville. And so when Charlottesville goes back into Union control, the hospital does stay open and treats both Union and Confederate patients. So at that point, a lot of the drama between the Board of Visitors and the Confederate government subsides because the area is no longer under control of the
Right. There's no more Confederate government, really.
Exactly. But there was, I mean, quite a bit of tension and drama, and kind of ideologically, they're still very, very supportive of the Confederate government and of the Confederate war effort. But in reality, they don't love the impact that it's had on the university.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and here at the museum, we're always kind of looking for parallels between then and now, and of course, while acknowledging none of these are really perfect one-to-one parallels, but the university sort of experiencing dilemmas that a number of businesses are experiencing now that have to be closed. They're just suddenly missing all of this income, that they were expecting to have, and now there's things that need doing. Thankfully, at least I'm hoping anyway, that not a lot of places their property is being damaged or anything like that. But in some cases, places are being sort of adapted for use as hospitals and things like that. So, I mean, these sorts of issues are not unfamiliar, unfortunately, to some places today. So, anyway, all very fascinating. And yeah, just as we come to a close here, not to put you on the spot, but if someone's curious about reading about wartime Charlottesville, do you have any either books or websites or resources to point people to?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the number one book that I relied on during my research was a book by Irvin Jordan, and he works at UVA. He's a historian at UVA. He is really phenomenal, really wonderful. He's got all sorts of publications. Some of them are easily accessible online through oh gosh, what's it called? something like the Virginia Encyclopedia or Encyclopedia of Virginia History, something along those lines. It's Irvin, Ervin, Jordan, like you would expect. So he's a really, really wonderful historian who's done a phenomenal job of digging into these kind of niche stories about Charlottesville and UVA during the Civil War. And he has a book on the subject, but he has tons of online researches about the subject too. So I would say he is one of the best bets. And of course, I would love to shamelessly plug the Now Center for Civil War History, since they kept me employed my last year, and really was such a wonderful place to work. I mean, I don't have a graduate degree in history. I only have my bachelor's, and so to be able as an undergraduate to dive into historical research and to really be empowered to look into these stories, and one of which was able to come to fruition as a blog post for you all, was wonderful. And so they have some fantastic digital resources and
And the Now Center is spelled N-A-U?
N-A-U, yes, exactly. So not quite like it sounds.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was good fun. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Again, please like and share the video if you can. Please consider becoming a member of the museum if you can, or donating during this time while our doors are closed. If you've enjoyed these videos, all that money goes directly towards making these videos happen and all that sort of thing. So we hope you enjoyed this one. And thank you, Amelia, for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a wonderful disruption to my, like I was joking in the beginning, my typical workday from my living room.
Good. Well, we're glad to be a part of that. So this is John and Amelia signing off.